The church bells tolled with cruel irony, their chime meant to announce joy, but echoing like a death knell through the dusty streets of the frontier town. Inside, the guests whispered and shifted on their benches, their eyes fixed on the groom, standing tall at the altar, his pride as sharp as the steel of a revolver. The bride-to-be trembled under her veil, unaware that the ceremony about to bind her was already cursed. For the doors of the church were about to open, and with them, a truth that would burn deeper than gunpowder. As the final hymn rose, the wooden doors creaked apart, and silence swept the crowd. Framed in the blinding light of the midday sun stood a woman draped not in lace, but in dust and sorrow. Her dress bore the wear of forgotten miles, her eyes hollow with betrayal, and in her arms she carried a child, swaddled against her chest. Gasps cut through the congregation like blades. Some turned their faces away. Others leaned forward with hungry eyes. The groom, once steady, felt his knees weaken as his past walked back into the room. The abandoned wife had returned, not with vengeance in her eyes, but with the undeniable proof of his broken vow. Every whisper in town, every shadow of rumor, stood now in flesh before the altar. The child's cry pierced the silence, carrying an innocence that no lie could erase. It was not merely a scene of scandal. It was a reckoning, a story etched into the heart of the West where truth, once buried, always clawed its way back to the surface. The air grew thick, suffocating under the weight of unspoken judgments. Men tightened their jaws, women clutched their pearls, and the preacher, frozen mid-sentence, lowered his eyes to the Bible as though the words had fled from its pages. The bride-to-be's hand shook, her veil quivering as the reality settled. The man she was about to marry had built his promise on quicksand. The outlaw's world was filled with bullets and betrayal. But here, inside a church, the wound was cut by silence sharper than any blade. In that moment, the abandoned wife stood taller than any gunman, her resolve carved from sorrow and survival. She had not come to beg, nor to curse. She had come to reveal. The groom's reputation, his carefully woven mask, unraveled before the very eyes of those who had once praised him. And with a single step forward, her presence turned what should have been a wedding into a trial, one where the jury was the entire town, and the sentence had already been written in whispers carried on the wind. The groom's face drained of color, his proud stance faltering as though the earth beneath him had crumbled. His eyes darted between the woman at the door and the child she carried, the weight of recognition pulling at him like a noose. The congregation held its breath, their silence louder than any gunshot in the canyon. For years, he had built a new life, one scrubbed clean of past mistakes. But the past, relentless as the desert sun, had come to stand in flesh and blood before him. The abandoned wife's steps echoed on the wooden floorboards as she advanced, each stride slow and deliberate, her presence both haunting and unshakable. Dust clung to her hem, and the shadows of hardship trailed behind her like ghosts. Yet in her arms lay innocence, eyes too young to know betrayal, a heartbeat untouched by the cruelty of men. The child, restless, whimpered softly, and the sound pierced through the sanctuary like a confession the groom could no longer silence. The bride-to-be staggered back, her gloved hand clutching her chest. She had heard whispers, of course, but dismissed them as the jealous talk of those who envied her match. Now, confronted with truth swaddled in linen, she realized she had been groomed for humiliation. Her gaze turned to the groom, searching for denial, but finding only the raw panic of a man cornered by fate. The shame she felt bled into the crowd, twisting their curiosity into judgment. Murmurs rose, first timid, then bolder, like embers catching flame. Old men who had once raised toasts to the groom now spat curses under their breath. Women, their hands still clutching rosaries, shook their heads in pity for the child. The preacher shifted uneasily, torn between the duty of silence and the burden of truth. The West had long been a land where secrets could be buried beneath dust, but when unearthed, they always demanded blood or redemption. And yet, the abandoned wife spoke no words of anger. She did not raise her voice nor plead for justice. Her silence was heavier than accusation, her calm more devastating than rage. It was as though she knew the town would render its verdict for her. She merely lifted the child higher, letting all see what had been hidden. In that simple act, she delivered a truth no bullet could silence and no preacher could wash away. The groom tried to step forward, his boots scraping against the floor, but the weight of every eye pinned him where he stood. His throat worked as though to speak, yet no words came. He was a man unarmed, not by the lack of steel at his side, but by the presence of truth. The West respected strength, but it revered honesty, and in that moment, he possessed neither. The abandoned wife halted before the altar, her shadow falling across the bride-to-be. She did not look at the other woman with malice, but with a gaze filled with a sorrow too deep for rivalry. "He made a vow once," she said softly, her voice carrying through the hushed room, "and I am the proof of how quickly he broke it." Gasps rippled through the church like the crack of a whip, each word branding the groom with shame he could never outrun. The child stirred again, reaching out a tiny hand, as if instinctively seeking the father who stood paralyzed before him. The sight unraveled what little composure the groom had left. His eyes glistened with a torment he could not disguise, his lips trembling as though each breath cost him dearly. The bride-to-be turned away, tears burning her veil, her dream collapsing in shards sharper than broken glass. The preacher finally raised his hand, his voice trembling as he tried to bring order. "This house is meant for truth and union, not deception." But his words fell into the firestorm of whispers that swelled into open condemnation. Men who had once shaken the groom's hand now muttered about betrayal. Women who had admired the bride's fortune now pitied her downfall. The weight of the West's judgment fell fast and merciless, as it always did. Through it all, the abandoned wife stood resolute, her child nestled against her heart. She had walked into this church not to reclaim love, but to reclaim her dignity, to show the town the cost of betrayal. And though her voice had spoken only once, the silence that followed carried her message louder than any sermon. The groom's reputation was no longer his to shape. It belonged to the whispers of the people, and those whispers would echo far beyond the church walls, carried like dust on the endless prairie wind. The church had become a furnace of whispers, the walls trembling with judgment and shame. The groom, trapped under the weight of so many eyes, finally found his voice, but it cracked like a weak branch in the wind. "It isn't what it looks like," he muttered, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. No man in the West survived on excuses, and his were thinner than the dust blowing outside. The abandoned wife raised her chin, her silence striking him harder than bullets ever could. The bride-to-be's veil slipped from her head, falling like a shroud to the floor. She stared at the man she had trusted, her tears glistening in the light of the stained glass. With every heartbeat, her hope dissolved into ash. She had walked into this church, believing she was stepping into a future of honor and pride. Yet now she realized she was only a pawn in a story already written in betrayal. Her trembling hands clutched at nothing, for nothing remained. The townsfolk began to speak more boldly, no longer hushed but sharp, their words slicing through the groom's pride. "A coward," someone spat from the back. "A liar," another hissed. The sound swelled, a chorus of condemnation that no preacher could silence. In the West, a man's word was worth more than gold, and once it was broken, no fortune could restore it. The groom's fortune, his respect, his very standing, crumbled before the entire town. The abandoned wife held the child higher, letting the crowd see the innocence of a life born from promises discarded. The baby's small hand curled toward the light, oblivious to the storm it had revealed. In that fragile gesture, the congregation saw not scandal, but truth undeniable. The West, harsh and merciless, also had a way of cherishing truth when it rose from the ashes of deceit. And now, that truth stood at the altar, undeniable as the rising sun. The groom's knees buckled, and he sank against the pulpit, his pride shattered. He had stood as a man ready to bind his life to another, but he now faced a greater vow, the one he had already broken. The abandoned wife, though weary and scarred, stood taller than him, the child in her arms a living verdict. In that moment, it was not the preacher, nor the town, but fate itself that pronounced judgment. The bride-to-be could no longer bear the sight. She tore the ring from her finger and cast it to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent church. Her sobs filled the air, raw and unrestrained, before she turned and fled down the aisle, her white dress dragging through the dust of disgrace. The congregation parted for her, some with pity, others with grim satisfaction. In the West, illusions shattered quickly, and hers had died before they even began. The groom reached out, as if to stop her, but his hand fell useless at his side. He had lost not only her, but everything he had hoped to build from lies. His eyes turned to the abandoned wife, but she offered no comfort, no softness. She had not come to reclaim him. She had come to expose him. And in that revelation, he stood utterly alone. The revelation struck her like a blow. All this time, she had believed their marriage was born of survival, of convenience, perhaps even hidden desire. But now she saw it for what it was, a vow carried out of loyalty, not love. Her chest tightened, grief tangling with anger. She had given her heart to the brother, but he had given her only duty, a duty that kept him chained to a ghost that refused to rest. Tears stung her eyes, but she bit them back, unwilling to let him see her break. "And what of you?" she asked bitterly. "Was there never a choice for you in this?" His silence was answer enough. The canyon swallowed her question whole, its walls echoing with the weight of everything left unsaid. In that silence, she realized the truth she had feared most. She was not just married to him. She was married to the shadow of the dead man who lay between them. As they rode on, her heart ached with the cruelest of ironies. That love, in the West, was never simple. It was a currency paid in blood, in secrets, and in promises carved into the dying breaths of men. And for the widow, the cost of that love was only just beginning to reveal itself. That night, the fire burned low, and the widow sat apart from him, her veil casting shadows over her tear-stained face. She felt betrayed, not only by the dead husband who had carried secrets to the grave, but by the living brother who had chained her to vows born of duty rather than love. Yet beneath the anger, another truth unsettled her. Despite everything, her heart still quickened in his presence. The contradiction tore at her, leaving her restless under the stars. The brother, for his part, remained silent, sharpening his knife by the dying embers. His jaw was clenched, his movements precise, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. Protecting her had been his promise, but wanting her was the sin he could not confess. Each glance in her direction was a battle between honor and desire, and though he tried to bury it, the desert had a way of dragging every secret into the open. When the coyotes howled in the distance, she flinched. He noticed, and for the briefest moment he softened. "You're safe here," he murmured, his voice low, almost tender. She turned toward him, startled, her breath catching. It was the first time he had spoken to her not as a guardian or a brother-in-law, but as a man. The words lingered between them, dangerous and intoxicating, until silence swallowed them once again. Sleep would not come to her. She lay awake, staring at the stars through the cracks of the old cabin roof, her thoughts spiraling. What if her husband had known of the bond growing between them even before death? What if the final vow was not protection, but punishment, a way to bind them in a marriage of guilt, ensuring neither of them would ever be free? The thought chilled her more than the desert night. By dawn, she resolved to uncover the truth her late husband had left behind. If his brother would not tell her everything, then she would force the past into the light herself. For only by confronting that truth could she decide if her heart belonged to the living man beside her, or if it was still shackled to the grave. The trail led them to a forgotten outpost, a place her husband had often spoken of but never taken her to. The buildings were little more than crumbling wood and dust, yet the brother seemed to know every corner as though he had walked its streets 100 times. The widow's suspicions deepened with every step. Why had her husband hidden this place from her? And why did his brother lead her here now, as if guided by invisible threads? The crowd thinned, but the story would not. It would cling to every saloon wall, every ranch house, every whispered prayer in the dark. The West thrived on legends, and this day had given birth to one more. A woman, abandoned but unbroken, who carried her child into the very heart of shame and left with her head unbowed. And the man who once stood tall at the altar now walked away a shadow, forever marked by the truth he could not outrun. That night, the town saloon overflowed with voices. Cowboys, ranchers, gamblers, all repeated the same story, each version growing sharper with drink. Glasses slammed against tables as men swore that no betrayal could go unpunished, while women nodded with knowing eyes. The tale of the abandoned wife had already begun its transformation into legend, carried by firelight and whiskey. In the West, truth was not merely remembered. It was immortalized in the mouths of those who survived it. The groom did not show his face. He hid in the shadows of his home, curtains drawn, his pride bleeding like a wound no bandage could heal. Every creak of the floor reminded him of vows broken. Every silence screamed of judgment. He had been a man who sought to erase his past, but the West had a cruel way of dragging past sins into the light. And now, he knew, no ranch nor fortune could buy back the honor he had lost. The abandoned wife rested in a modest inn on the edge of town, the child safe in her arms. The innkeeper's wife brought her food without charge, whispering words of respect instead of pity. Other women came too, some silently, some with tears, offering blankets, clothes, and kindness. They saw in her not scandal, but resilience. They saw a woman who had faced the fire of humiliation and emerged unburned. In her silence, she had spoken for every woman who had been cast aside. Outside, the prairie stretched endless under the moonlight, the wind carrying with it the echoes of the day. Somewhere in that vast silence, coyotes called, their voices rising like mournful hymns. The child stirred, and the abandoned wife whispered softly, promising a future forged not by the cruelty of a man, but by her own unyielding will. In that whisper, she planted a seed of hope, one that no betrayal could ever uproot. The West would remember her not only as the woman who exposed her husband at his own wedding, but as the embodiment of truth's quiet power. In a land built on pride and violence, she had drawn no weapon, yet she had won the deadliest duel of all. And though the trail ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. She and her child would walk it with dignity, while the man who betrayed them would ride forever under the shadow of disgrace. The following days turned the once proud groom into a ghost within his own town. He no longer rode through the streets with his head high. Instead, he kept to the alleys, his hat pulled low to shield himself from the stares. Yet no brim was wide enough to cover the whispers that followed him everywhere. In the West, a man could survive hunger, storms, and bullets, but he could not survive the loss of his word. His reputation, once stronger than steel, had been shattered like glass, and no hand could piece it back together. Meanwhile, the abandoned wife found herself walking with unexpected strength. Where once she had been a shadow, overlooked and discarded, now she was greeted with nods of respect. Women admired her courage. Men, though uneasy, acknowledged her as a force that even lawmen dared not ignore. Her child, cradled in her arms, was no longer seen as a mark of shame, but as a living testament to truth. In the silent language of the West, she acclaimed victory without ever drawing a gun. The preacher, who had presided over the ill-fated wedding, spoke softly of the event in the days that followed. "The Lord has his ways of revealing what is hidden," he told the congregation. His words, heavy with meaning, spread beyond the church walls, feeding the story that grew larger with every retelling. In this land, where legends were born overnight, the abandoned wife had become more than a woman. She had become a symbol. The groom's allies tried to defend him, insisting that the past should remain buried. Yet each time they spoke, the town remembered the sight of the woman walking through the church doors with the child in her arms. That image was more powerful than any excuse, more indelible than any plea. It was a wound carved into the town's memory, a reminder that betrayal left scars not only on those abandoned, but on the very soil of the community. And so the groom, once hailed as a man of promise, became the lesson parents whispered to their sons. A man's honor is worth more than land, gold, or marriage. To lose it is to lose everything. The West had no patience for weakness disguised as pride, and the abandoned wife had shown them all the cost of deceit. Her story became their story, passed from saloon to campfire, binding the people together in the way only truth could. One evening, As the sun bled into the horizon, the abandoned wife stood at the edge of town with her child, watching the sky burn in hues of red and gold. Behind her, whispers of her courage continued to spread, but in her heart, there was no triumph, only resolve. She had not sought revenge, only recognition. She had not come to destroy the man who betrayed her, only to reclaim the dignity he had tried to erase. Now, with her truth revealed, she faced the vast unknown of the frontier, where survival demanded more than strength. It demanded faith. The townsfolk watched her from a distance, some offering food, others offering shelter, but she refused to linger in pity. She knew the West was not kind to those who stayed too long in the shadows of others' mistakes. Her path lay ahead, in the wilderness, where her child would grow not under the weight of disgrace, but under the freedom of truth. Each step she took was a declaration that she would not be defined by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to become. In the saloon, men spoke of her with the same awe reserved for gunslingers and sheriffs who had carved justice from chaos. They called her brave, unyielding, a woman of the frontier who had faced the cruelty of both man and society with nothing but the strength of her silence. They raised glasses to her name, their voices carrying into the night, turning her into a legend that even whiskey could not drown. The groom, meanwhile, became a ghost whose story was told not with admiration but with scorn. His name was whispered in warning, a reminder of what became of men who broke vows and tried to bury their sins. He rode alone, his shadow stretching long against the prairie, a man condemned not by the law but by the truth he could never escape. As the stars lit the sky, the abandoned wife whispered to her child, her voice steady despite the weariness in her bones. "We will walk a new path," she said, her words carrying the strength of every trial she had endured. And in the vast silence of the West, it seemed as though the land itself listened, the wind carrying her vow across the plains. For in her story, the frontier had found not just sorrow, but hope, the kind of hope that outlives betrayal and reshapes destiny. The days that followed wrapped the town in an uneasy calm, yet the story refused to die. Every porch, every saloon table, every fire under the stars carried the same tale: the wife who returned, the child who bore witness, and the man who fell from honor in a single heartbeat. The West had always thrived on legends of gunslingers and outlaws, but this was a different kind of legend, one born not from bullets, but from truth laid bare before an entire congregation. The abandoned wife moved quietly through town, but wherever she went, people parted in silence, their gazes filled with a respect she had never known. Her child, carried close to her chest, became a symbol of innocence in a land that often crushed it. She had not won with violence or threats, but with dignity, and in the West, that kind of victory carved itself deeper than gunfire. Her presence alone reminded the townsfolk of the cost of lies, and of the strength it took to face them. The groom, meanwhile, withered under the weight of his disgrace. He no longer dared to walk the main street. He kept to the shadows, drinking alone, haunted not just by the woman who had exposed him, but by the echo of his own choices. His wealth, his land, his plans for power, all meant nothing now. In the eyes of the town, he was no man at all, just a hollow name dragged through the dust by his own betrayal. Some men tried to defend him, claiming the wife had been cruel in her timing, but their voices carried little weight. The image of her standing in the church, child in her arms, was too vivid to deny. It was burned into the collective memory of the town, a vision that no excuses could erase. The West had always judged swiftly, and in this case, its verdict was final. And so the tale grew, reaching beyond the borders of the town. Travelers carried it to other settlements, where strangers marveled at the courage of a woman who had walked into the heart of her own humiliation and turned it into strength. The story became a living thing, a warning and an inspiration, a truth that rode the wind across the frontier. By the time the next Sunday came, the church pews were full once more, but their purpose had shifted. The preacher stood before his flock, speaking not of celebration, but of honesty. "In this land," he said, his voice carrying to every corner, "a man's word is his life. When it is broken, no blessing can bind it back together." His sermon was not about the groom alone. It was about every soul who sat before him, a reminder that in the harsh soil of the West, integrity was the only seed that could take root. The abandoned wife did not attend that service. She had already spoken her truth, and her path now stretched beyond the town's borders. She packed her few belongings, secured her child against her chest, and walked toward the horizon. She had not looked back. The town would remember her forever, but she had no need of their whispers. Her future lay on the open trail, where dignity, once reclaimed, could never again be stolen. The groom, broken and alone, watched her departure from a distance, his heart twisted with regret. But regret was a poor companion in the West. He had gambled with vows and lost everything a man could lose. No sermon, no plea, no prayer could erase the image of her standing in the church with the child in her arms. That vision would haunt him as long as he breathed. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the prairie, the townsfolk whispered her name as though it were part of the wind. They spoke of her strength, her silence, her courage. They spoke of the day a woman stood taller than any man, proving that in the unforgiving West, dignity was sharper than any blade and stronger than any bullet. And thus the story settled into legend. The abandoned wife, once shamed and forgotten, became a figure of respect and remembrance. Her husband's disgrace became his eternal shadow, while her act of defiance turned into a beacon. In the heart of the Old West, where betrayal was common and truth rare, her courage stood as proof that even the most broken vow could give birth to a tale that would never die. The story of the abandoned wife did not end at the doors of that church. It began there. In one single moment, she transformed humiliation into strength, silence into testimony, and rejection into legacy. Her presence reminded everyone that truth cannot remain buried forever. It will always rise, even if carried in the fragile arms of a child. What seemed like her downfall became the very fire that forged her dignity, making her stronger than the man who tried to erase her. The groom's disgrace serves as a warning carved deep into the memory of the West. A man's honor is not measured by wealth, land, or fine words, but by the promises he keeps. Once those promises are broken, no treasure can buy them back. His fall was not just his own. It was a lesson for all who believed they could outrun the weight of betrayal. And so, his shadow lingers, not as a man of pride, but as a symbol of what happens when pride is built on lies. But more powerful than disgrace is resilience. The abandoned wife became more than a woman wronged. She became the voice of every soul cast aside, proving that dignity can be reclaimed even when the world conspires to strip it away. Her strength was not in vengeance, but in her calm defiance. She did not carry a weapon, yet she won the deadliest duel of all, the duel against silence and shame. In her victory, she showed that even the most fragile can hold unshakable power when armed with truth. This tale is more than a moment of scandal. It is a mirror held up to each of us. How often do we hide truths out of fear? How often do we measure our worth by the opinions of others, forgetting that true strength comes not from acceptance, but from standing tall in the storm? The abandoned wife reminds us that sometimes what looks like an ending is only the doorway to a new beginning, one built on courage instead of compromise. If this story moved you, let its message continue beyond this moment. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of her journey spoke most to you? Did you feel the weight of her silence, or the sting of his betrayal? Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so together we can keep uncovering stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the strength hidden within us all. Because in the end, the West does not just remember the gunfighters, it remembers the truth tellers.